Now that we've spent some time looking at some of the basic introductory issues concerning James I, we talked about the idea and the concept of the political nation. We talked about the idea of James's views on monarchy, as well as some of his favourites throughout his reign. We're going to start going through his parliaments in the next few videos. We will talk about the major issues concerning each of these parliaments, and we'll talk about the reasons for their calling and the reasons for their dissolution. The point is to illustrate just how clearly there were tensions beginning to essentially bubble up under the surface concerning his relationship, the monarch's relationship with Parliament. And we're going to begin, aptly, with James's first Parliament, which was convened in 1604 and lasted for quite a while, in fact, until 1611, and was very, very important because what it did was set the tone for the monarch's relationship with English Parliament. In 1603, of course, James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England after the death of Elizabeth, and he inherits a stable but a relatively financially strained kingdom. And given his personal beliefs in things like the divine right of kings, we can see that there will, of course, be ideological conflict between him and his parliament. So, the opening of Parliament takes place in March 1604, and it is formally opened on the 19th of March that same year, so basically a week later. Now, his inaugural speech, James's inaugural speech, emphasises the belief in the divine right of kings. He described kings as little gods on earth and asserted that monarchy was the supreme form of government. This was, of course, something that greatly impacted a number of members of Parliament, MPs, who had grown accustomed to a more cooperative governance style that had existed under Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, of course, was still autocratic and had autocratic tendencies and often clashed with Parliament at various different stages, but she nevertheless had a slightly more cooperative style, whereas now James has entered into the fold and is starting to assert things like the belief in the divine right of kings and all these quite crazy ideas that were not completely outdated at the time, but they were beginning to become a lot more outdated, and so it was a bit of a shock to the system when they are sort of coming back in and they're in vogue again, things like the divine right of kings. Now, the issues of his first parliament were numerous. There were a few issues that needed to be sorted and solved. The first of these was this idea of union between Scotland and England. James I of England was also James VI of Scotland, and in fact sought to try and formalise a formal union between England and Scotland. This is seen in his opening address to Parliament on the 19th of March, 1604, when he expressed a desire to avoid being a husband to two wives, essentially. Now, the Commons opposed this idea, fearing that it would disrupt the English common law and also the national identity of the country. And so, although the Union of England and Scotland Act of 1603 authorised commissioners to discuss the idea of union, any kind of substantial progress on this particular issue were heavily limited. Additionally, we see that there is a formal union that is aimed by James, which he called the Blessed Union. He declared himself, for example, in 1604, the King of Great Britain, a symbolic move that was not in fact sanctioned by law in any meaningful sense. At this stage then, early on in James's reign, it is basically very clear that Parliament was very deeply resistant to the idea of unity between England and Scotland, particularly English MPs who feared legal confusion. Now, the result is therefore that the Commons rejected the proposal for formal legislative union, which had been proposed in 1607, although there had been the passing of some limited reforms, such as the repeal of what were known as hostile laws in relation to this idea of union and hostile laws towards Scotland specifically. There was also the issue of the Buckinghamshire election dispute, which had taken place in 1604. This was a very early major conflict that arose over the election of somebody by the name of Sir Francis Goodwin for Buckinghamshire. Now, the Court of Chancery was the legal institution that dealt with issues concerning equity. Essentially, very, 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 very brief overview of the history of English law. you sort of had a dual structure that existed for the majority of the English legal system, where you had the common law and you had the law of equity. And the idea of the equity court, the Court of Chancery, was to try and sort of smooth out some of the rough edges of the common law and to impose decisions that essentially would result in a more just outcome. The idea of equity refers to the idea of fairness. It comes from the Latin word aequitas. Now, the Court of Chancery was the sort of institution that was born out of the royal prerogative that essentially gave relief to people who had the correct legal judgment against them in a common law case, but because the common law was quite rigid at times, were unfair in terms of their rulings. Equity still exists today, but equity sort of merged with the ordinary legal system in the 1800s with the Judicature Acts. Anyway, there you go. Quick overview of history of English law for you. So we have a conflict here then. We have the election of Sir Francis Goodwin for Buckinghamshire, and the Court of Chancery annulled his election due to a prior outlawry, which ultimately prompted the Commons to assert their privilege to try and reinstate him. So we see essentially a conflict between the Court of Chancery and the House of Commons. King James would intervene and suggest a new election, which the Commons vehemently resisted, emphasising their exclusive right to judge election returns. The dispute would lead to the formation of a standing committee on elections, and it really underscored the Commons' determination to protect their own parliamentary privileges. And so ultimately, literally a year after he takes the throne, we see a major constitutional clash occurring between Sir Francis Goodwin, as elected for MP for Buckinghamshire, and the Court of Chancery that tried to annul his election. The Court of Chancery, of course, annulled the result because of there was essentially a number of outlawries for debt, and the king backed the new election and favoured somebody different to Sir Francis Goodwin. In fact, the king had favoured Sir John Fortescue. Now, the Commons insisted their right to judge election returns, as I mentioned, and so after a debate, a compromise would be reached. Goodwin was persuaded to withdraw, and a new election, in fact, was held, but the incident really exposed major tensions over this idea of parliamentary privilege. But things don't just end there in terms of issues and conflicts between James and his first parliament. The next major issue concerned the imposition of royal finances. Ultimately, the Crown's financial problems would become a recurring theme, given the fact that James's spending, especially on his court favourites and his extravagance, would start to exacerbate tensions further. The Commons would be reluctant to grant subsidies without redress of grievances, essentially suggesting that we will give you your subsidies, but we're going to complain about it and we're going to require you or ask that you do things to change your behaviour. Disputes over impositions, so impositions were essentially customs duties that were levied by King James himself, the royal prerogative, would start to escalate, with Parliament arguing that these should not be raised without parliamentary consent. So impositions were customs duties that could be levied by the king himself, and ultimately, whenever the king did so, Parliament would get increasingly more angry, suggesting that to do so would to violate the basic idea of Parliament's concerning over finances. This led in 1606 to the Bateses case, where the courts sided with the Crown and asserted that the king could levy impositions, could put customs duties through the royal prerogative for trade regulation, without needing parliamentary consent, which of course alarmed a number of MPs and worsened relations even deeper. And then finally, I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about the form of apology and sanctification, which took place in 1604. This was a committee in the Commons which drafted the form of apology and sanctification, and the form of apology was essentially a document that asserted that parliamentary liberties and started to also complain about some of the autocratic nature of King James's rule. So essentially it was a petition to assert their own parliamentary rights and to also complain about James. in response to what was it was essentially in response to what was seen as royal overreach, and they, like I said, asserted their rights and their privileges, and suggested that these rights and privileges were inherent to Parliament. They weren't granted by the monarch. This idea that the monarch is the divine leader and the divine ruler from God does not mean that he gave the rights of Parliament to them. He gave Parliament their rights. Those parliamentary privileges and those rights are inherent to Parliament. They do not come from the monarchy. The document criticises James's interference with parliamentary matters, for things like the election dispute in Buckinghamshire, and continued and also emphasised, the Commons' role in governance, but it was never formally presented to the King. It defended parliamentary privileges, particularly things like freedom of speech and the self-regulation of parliamentary membership, of course, reference back to the Buckinghamshire election dispute. Now, it was never formally presented to the King, but James was aware of this document. He was aware of its existence and was offended by its existence and viewed it as a challenge to his royal authority. And so, because the idea of this document even existing in theory or in principle was so much of a challenge to his reign and so offensive to him, it was never actually formally presented to him. And so when we get to this sort of end of 1611 and we start to think about the dissolving of his parliament, we can see that James clearly preferred personal rule and private negotiation over the formal institutional structure of parliament. He lacked Elizabeth's political tact and was often alienated by MPs. He made often quite long and lecturing speeches. He would often rely on the royal prerogative, and he favoured Scots at court, which of course was resented by a number of English MPs, as you can probably imagine. And so the first Parliament effectively ends in 1610. After years of mounting tensions over royal finances, religious policies, and the royal prerogative, James would dissolve it in 1611, but like I said, the failure of the Great Contract of 1610, which was proposed by Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, was the final blow to this first Parliament. It essentially sought to exchange annual revenue from Parliament in return for the Crown giving some of the feudal dues. And because this, of course, did not in fact work, it was a failure, it was never accepted, Parliament became effectively null and neutered in 1610, and it was formally dissolved in 1611.